Hey everyone, welcome to a video on, that's right, bonds and bond valuation. So we'll start with some basic terminology and then understand how we can apply TVM in pricing bonds. And then finally, we will just consider some different types of bonds and see if we can figure out some differences. Beginning with bonds. So what are bonds? Well, they're basically just loans or IOUs. Sometimes they might be referred to as promissory note because it's basically a promise to pay back the loan amount. Usually governments or corporations will issue the bonds to raise capital. And for the people who are actually purchasing these bonds, or the lenders, the way that it's valuable for them is that they will receive, first they'll receive a sort of annual or semi-annual type of interest. Okay, so this is considered an annuity series because they get equal payment. Okay. And they'll also receive a return on that sort of principal amount that they loaned out, which is the future lump sum of the bond. Okay, so when the bond expires or matures, we'll receive that back as well. So those are really two kind of components we have to think about when we're dealing with bonds. And because of that, we can use the present value techniques, but we just have to think of it in two combinations. So really we're considering the present value of the annuity, okay, again, which is really the present value of all the interest that's going to be earned throughout those equal payments. And then also we have to consider the future value of that lump sum, okay, which is that future value at maturity. So given those two, we can help us determine how to price a bond. More on that in a moment, but let's continue with some more terminology really. So when we look at a bond here, we can also need to know a few other sort of terms, okay? So what do we mean by par value? Well, par value is really the principal or the face value of the bond, okay, which interest is paid, okay? So usually it's $1,000, okay? And we'll talk more about par value and what happens when, or what does it mean when a bond is sold below or above par value, okay? But for now we should understand par value is really what we mean by the face value. Now, there's two rates that are really relevant when it comes to bonds, and you can see here, for instance, the coupon rate. And that coupon rate is associated with that periodic interest rate that is going to be provided for. So those equal payments, that annuity that we mentioned in terms of how the bond is sort of valuable for the lender. Okay, so in other words, you earn interest when lending out this money or purchasing this bond. Okay, in order to do that, we need to know the coupon rate. Now, once we have the coupon rate, we can figure out the coupon or the coupon payment. And again, this is now the sort of the dollar amount that the holder will receive. Okay, with those periodic payments. Okay, so that's not sort of step one in terms of the components. Then we also have to consider, remember, that future lump sum. So maturity date, again, is when the bond expires or when it matures. And that's really when that future lump sum is due back to the bondholder. Okay. Now, in regards to the maturity date, we also want to know the yield to maturity, which basically helps us understand what the return was on that investment, what the return was on that bond. So if the holder holds on to that bond until the maturity date, we can figure out what the yield to maturity was, or in other words, the return on that investment. Okay, so those are some more terms that we'll be discussing throughout the chapter. Let's look at an example just to, again, help us become more familiar with bonds and some of the components. So here we see basically a B-rated bond. Okay, now it's issued by Hertz Corporation. And we can see actually the selling price, so it's selling at $91.50. And we should start to think about this as 91.5% of par value. Okay, so in terms of price, if we figured this is 91.5% of par, think of it as the price is $915. Okay. And if we want to think about what the annual coupon payments are, so in other words, what can we expect in terms of those periodic payments, Well, we know the coupon rate is 6.35%. So if we again multiply that by our par value, we know that we will receive $63.50 for each payment. Okay, so that's what we mean by, or help us understand where we can get some of these figures from. Now, in terms of maturity date, again, we see the maturity date here. Okay, what this signifies is basically if we held this bond until the maturity date, then we would receive a yield of about 15.438%. Okay, that's if we held it until maturity. There's also another yield that sometimes you'll see, okay, which is the current yield. So basically, this helps us understand, basically based on the current coupon rate. Okay, notice how we're using the coupon rate to figure this out, but basically it will tell us it will pay out 6.94% currently. Okay, but this will change particularly based off of the price of the bond. So when the price of the bond changes, then you can see that this will change. So this is very much really a point in time. Okay, but really our main focus is understanding the coupon rate and how that helps us determine the annual coupon payments. Okay, and the yield to maturity is going to help us basically understand the value of the bond, the price of the bond. More on that in a second. Okay. So in terms of calculating a bond, as always, it's helpful to draw out a timeline. But let's look at an example here. Okay, so in this case here, we have a double A-rated bond. Okay, so it's a higher rated bond than the previous one. It's a 20-year bond. We have our coupon rate. Okay, and in this case, it says paid annually because sometimes, and we will talk about this in a moment, sometimes it might be paid semi-annual. So we have to make that adjustment. And we see that the corporate bond par value is 1,000 and our yield to maturity is 10%. Okay, so again, if we start with a timeline just so we can kind of get an idea, okay, we can see here, just like we talked about in terms of annuity payments, again, in this case, it's going to be paid annually. So that's how we know that we have 20 periods, okay, because it's 20 years and there's one payment for each year. Now, a question you might have is, how did we get the $80? Okay, that's a good question. So remember, if we basically take our annual coupon rate here and we multiply by the par value, that's going to help us understand or calculate what we can expect. So in other words, the lender is going to receive $80 each year for the next 20 years. Okay, so that's our annuity for this holding this bond. Okay, but we also want to understand what is going to be the future value of the bond. Okay, so if we have a year to maturity rate, okay, of 10%. Okay, in other words, think of it as the discount rate, which is given to us. Okay, we should be able to understand a few things. Now, we always need to know the number of periods when we're dealing with our TVM. So again, in this case, because it is annual, the number of periods is equal to the number of years. Okay, and again, future value. Remember, what is the future value? Well, that's the par value, right? So we know that basically after the end of year 20, we're going to get back $1,000. That's our future value. So given that information, we should be able to discount to the present value and understand the price of our present value, right? And that's what we just did. So, using those formulas, well, specifically using our spreadsheet or our calculator, okay, we're going to be able to discount that back to the present value. So in other words, the price of this bond is $829.73. Now, again, if the yield to maturity changes, then this price will change. We'll discuss that more later on. But this is just a sort of our first example of how we price a bond. And hopefully we start to see the comparisons and the relevance of what we've been doing in terms of TVM. Okay, so this is an annual bond. Okay, obviously it pays annually. However, most corporations or governments pay coupons on a semi-annual basis, right? So in other words, they're going to provide 2 coupon payments per year instead of 1, which was the example we just saw. Okay. We also might have companies that issue 0 coupon bonds. Okay. So what does that imply? Well, it actually means that there are no annual or any payments until the maturity date. Okay. So in other words, it's not paying out any coupons periodically. Now, why would you want to, purchase something like this? Well, they sell it at a very deep discount, so it's another option. Okay, but in terms of computing for these bonds, we obviously, just as we've sort of recognized before, we have to make some adjustments. Okay, particularly when dealing with semi-annual, we need to make sure that they are agreement in terms of the number of periods and the rate. Okay, so for example, right, when we're dealing with semi or annuals, coupon has to be divided by 2. Okay, because again, we understand that the rate is no longer based off of an annual; it's going to be based off of a semi-annual. So in other words, if you have an 8% annual coupon rate, then that's really a 4% because we're dividing by 2 semi-annual. Okay. Now the number of years obviously have to be multiplied by 2 because now we're actually getting paid twice a year instead of once, right? So again, over 10 years, if we have to multiply the 10 years by 2 because we're going to get paid out 20 years over the 10 years. We're going to get paid out 20 times, okay? And also the year to maturity is divided by 2 because again, the rate is now divided by 2 instead of considering it yield to maturity is typically an annual yield. Okay, so we have to make those adjustments. And don't worry, you'll see that when we deal with it on our spreadsheets and things like that. Okay, but just remember that as always, they have to be in agreement. Okay, so the number of periods and the correct rate have to be in agreement. So that's important to know for semi-annual bonds. But what about 0 coupon bonds? Again, these bonds don't pay out any periodic rates, okay? And again, they're sold at a very deep discount because really there's not much incentive or not as much incentive for the lender because they don't actually receive, any payment until the end of the bond, okay? But one thing to remember, this does not mean that it does not pay out any interest, okay? It just means that the interest is not paid out until the bond is matured, okay? So that's important to remember, okay? Again, same par value, right? But a little bit difference in terms of how we calculate the bond. Okay, so it's actually a little bit more simpler, and you'll see that in an example. But basically, again, we're really just trying to figure out, based off of the future value, right, which is the par value or the face value, we're going to discount that rate back to the present value or the price. And it really just depending on the discount rate or the yield to maturity that we expect. Okay, but in all cases, just remember that we have to agree together. Number of years need to agree with the correct rate. All right, so that's been a sort of introduction to bonds, trying to understand some of the differences. There'll be more to come, so not to worry. Thanks for watching and happy financing.